Hello everybody, this is Tip Top MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I am going to be breaking down all of the spoilers that have come out today being April 6th for Strixhaven Commander, also known as Commander 2021. So every day this week they're revealing a different deck, so we're going to be covering all of the cards that are new in the Prismari deck today, as well as looking at the deck list as a whole. Why don't we jump right into this? Starting off, let's take a look at the Commander, which was spoiled a little while back. Zephi, Conductor, is a 4-cost blue and red legendary creature human shaman. It's a 1/4, and it has Magecraft, which means whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, scry 1. If that spell's mana value is 5 or greater, create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. If that spell's mana value is 10 or greater, Zephi Thunder Collector deals 10 damage to an opponent chosen at random. So essentially, when you cast any spell, you're scrying 1, which is already pretty good. And then if you cast something with mana value, or also known as converted mana cost, 5 or higher, you get a 4/4 attached to your spell, which is pretty good. Then, if it's 10 or greater, you get to apparently summon a different creature with a different name. Joking aside, there's just a little bit of an error where in the text it says Thunder Collector, and the name is Thunder Conductor. But either way, you get to deal 10 damage, and you get to scry, and you get to make that 4/4. So it's kind of interesting. It's all about casting one, big spell, as opposed to where Izzet wants to cast lots of little spells. And they explained in an article that that's really what they wanted to do, was differentiate them from the guilds. And, Izzet's about casting lots of spells and getting lots of individual Magecraft triggers, where this is about getting a really big one. So I think that's kind of interesting. Either way, let's move on to the new cards. And this one is a new card, I just mean new cards that we haven't seen before. Starting off, we have Veyran, Voice of Duality. It's a 3-cost blue and red legendary creature, Efreet Wizard. It's a 2/2, and it says, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it's almost prowess, but it also counts on copy. So that's kind of interesting. If casting or copying an instant or sorcery causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this one is much more traditional Izzet in style. While the other one kind of wanted you to cast a big spell, this one wants you to maybe care about casting spells a little bit more. The other one was, hey, cast a big spell, get an advantage, and yes, you would get that advantage twice with this card, so it works well, but it also encourages you, this card more specifically, to have lots of effects that happen when you cast an instant or sorcery. So this one's about having lots of Magecraft triggers, where the other one is more about casting big spells. And if you put those together, it becomes this pretty cool thing where you're dealing 20 damage and all of that. But me personally, I actually think I prefer this guy as a commander. The other one just seems a little gimmicky in my opinion. This one allows you to get a little bit of value even if you're not casting 10 mana value spells. Next, we have Octavia, Living Thesis. So this is another legendary creature. This one cannot helm the deck just because it is mono blue. Either way, it's a 10-cost blue legendary creature, Elemental Octopus, 8/8, 8 arms. This spell costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. It has Ward 8, meaning to target it, you essentially have to pay 8 extra, otherwise the spell gets countered or ability gets countered. And then whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. Alright, so this card is kind of crazy. Getting 8 or more instant and sorcery cards sounds like it would be hard, and if you are in mono blue and this is your commander, it actually can be a little bit tricky. But if you're throwing this in a blue and red deck that wants to discard cards into their graveyard, it is not that hard to, Cathartic Reunion, discarding 2 instant and sorceries, drawing 3 more, boom, you just threw 3 instants and or sorceries into your graveyard for 2 mana. And so this seems like something that could come down really early. And it doesn't have hexproof, but it has Ward 8. So yes, technically, if your opponent has 9 mana, they can target it with a 1 mana removal spell or an ability, but 8 mana? If your opponents are spending 8 mana to kill this, you probably got it out not by paying 10, meaning that you're going to pay, 4 mana? So this is highly inefficient for your opponent to deal with, so they probably have to board wipe. And whenever you're casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. You have to do that, but you can always target Octavia. Ward only focuses on your opponent's abilities, and even if it didn't, you could just target Octavia and let it get countered. But I think it's really, really powerful, and it would be interesting to see if there's enough support in blue, which I don't think there is, to do a, X creature spell kind of deck, because a lot of Hydras, they cost X and like a green or just X, and then whenever, you know, they enter with that many counters. But if you can boost their power and toughness, their base power and toughness, because this isn't boosting it by 8, it is setting their base power and toughness. So if you can boost a 0/0 to be an 8/8 and it happened to have had 8 counters on it, well, now you just made it a 16/16. So I think that works really well together. Of course, this whole, like, not joke, but the whole point of the card is 8. And it seems really, really good. It doesn't seem that hard to get 8 or more instants and sorceries into your graveyard, and this just seems pretty decent. It's a big creature that's hard to remove, and it's coming down fairly early if you build your deck right. So I think this could actually be a pretty powerful card. I don't know if it's going to helm too many decks, but I think it could go into a lot of them. Next, we have Ryona, Fire Dancer. It's a 5-cost red legendary creature human wizard 3/4. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells you cast this turn. They gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. So if you cast, so it doesn't work on copies. So if you like infinitely copy spell, you don't get infinite copies. So I think that's very nice to see that it's not that easy to abuse. But if you cast just 3 spells, boom, you make 3 copies of another creature, you swing with them, or maybe they have an awesome ETB. Honestly, this seems like an amazing commander, and I think you'll see play a lot more than the mono blue one. I mean, I can just imagine a deck that has nice ETBs, it, you know, casts a lot of instant and sorcery spells. I can just see this deck, and I think it'll be very, very powerful. Yes, you can just get big creatures, and, you know, maybe you do get one of those creatures that's like, you know, it sacrifices itself at the end of turn, but it's like an 8/1 with trample. You make like a bunch of copies of that. It seems really, really good to me, and I am excited to see what people can do with it. Next, we have Dazzling Sphinx. It's a 5-cost blue creature Sphinx 4/5 with flying, and whenever it deals damage to a player, combat damage, that player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then that player puts the exiled cards that weren't cast this way on the bottom of their library in a random order. So when you hit your opponent, essentially they are cascading into an instant or sorcery, but you get to cast it. So let's say I hit my control, like you're playing against a control deck and they can't kill Dazzling Sphinx. Of course, this isn't a commander context. You hit them, maybe you go get a board wipe, or you don't get to go get, but maybe it rolls and you get a kill spell, and then you can direct that kill spell whatever you want because you can cast it without paying its mana cost. But maybe they're running an ultimatum, and now you just got a free ultimatum. Honestly, this really depends on what your opponents are playing, but it seems really, really good. I mean, the floor is a 5-cost 4/5 with flying, but I don't know if there's any, you know, game of Commander that's like ever been played where there has been no instant and sorcery in the game. I mean, your typical green deck will probably at least be running ramp. So this just seems like a really good card to me, and it's the kind of effect I really like. I liked Chaos Wand, which is like an artifact that lets you tap it, and it does the same effect, but you still have to pay the mana cost for the spell, I believe. I don't remember if you have to pay the mana cost. Either way, it like did this exact thing, but it was on an artifact and you had to pay mana to do it. This one seems better. I think in a lot of decks that run like flying creatures matter, I think this will see play there. And, you know, this also is letting you cast instants and sorceries without paying any mana, which means it may see play in decks that care about casting lots of instants and sorceries, as you can get all your Magecraft triggers. Next, we have Inspiring Refrain. It is a 6-cost blue sorcery. Draw 2 cards, then exile it with 3 time counters on it, and then it has Suspend 3 for 3 mana. So Divination is a 3-cost blue sorcery that says draw 2 cards. This is not technically definitely better, but essentially what you can do is on turn 3, you can kind of start this clock. And essentially turn 3, you pay 3 mana and you exile this thing, and then 3 turns later, you get to draw 2 cards. And you're like, that's not very good at all. But then, you know, 3 turns after that, you draw 2 cards, and that keeps happening without any mana investment. So if you're playing in a meta where it's very quick, very fast, this is an awful card. But if you're playing in a meta where things go on for a very long time, this is a value engine that's drawing you 2 cards every 3 turns. That really is hard to interact with. The only way to really interact with this is to counterspell the spell. It's not like there's an enchantment that's like bringing it back. This whole thing is designed to be a loop, and I think it's really interesting. I think decks that care about casting things from exile, casting things without paying mana costs, exiling things, that cards like that. So like Vega the Watcher is going to really like this card because it's just going to keep getting cast over and over again. Also decks that have counter manipulation, if you can turn, removing 2 suspend counters into drawing 2 cards, that's pretty good. So yeah, pretty awesome in my opinion. And you're going to see there's another card very similar to this in red that we'll get to a little bit later. Next we have Mus Vortex. It's X blue for a sorcery. Exile the top X cards of your library. You may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value X or less from among them without paying its mana cost. Then put the exiled instant and sorcery cards that weren't cast this way into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. First off, X spells are really good in this deck just because the commander, wants you to cast big spells, but if you just fill your decks with big spells, it's going to be hard for you to actually cast them if you draw them, versus this can be played both early and late game. It also is really good in an instant and sorcery deck where normally you're paying either blue in an X or blue in an X to draw X cards. This doesn't do that. It lets you actually kind of draw those cards, but only the instants and sorceries, and then lets you take one of those instants and sorceries and cast it if it has mana value X or less. So it kind of lets you not just spend all of your mana drawing cards, and instead lets you also cast something. So it feels like less of a turn wasted. However, you are kind of blindly going into your deck, so there's always going to be some risk. Next, we have Sly Instigator, not Investigator. It is a 4-cost blue creature human wizard 2/4, and you can pay blue and tap, and until your next turn, a target creature an opponent controls can't be blocked, goad that creature. So essentially you're saying, hey, target creature I don't own is going to hit somebody because it can't be blocked, but it also has to attack. So, it's a lot more of a benefit. Like when you goad someone's creature, they are not happy with you because, you're putting their creature in harm's way. This is not putting their creature in harm's way. And so it's more of you're making everyone else upset, not the person you're actually targeting with the ability. And I think it's a very interesting multiplayer dynamic. Next, we have Creative Technique. It's a 5-cost red sorcery with Demonstrate, which means when you cast a spell, you may make a copy of it, meaning you get 2 copies, and if you do, choose an opponent to also copy it, which is really good in Commander because you can often make a deal. Like, if this was in a 1v1 format, it would just be kind of garbage, but the fact that you can not only get 2 copies of it, but also get goodwill with a player is pretty cool. Either way, you can shuffle your library, then reveal cards from the top of it until you reveal a non-land card. Exile that card and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So you get 2 free things from your library, your opponent gets 1. If you're running this in a deck, you're probably running a lot of expensive spells, and so I feel like you're going to get the better benefit. You're going to probably pick the person who's playing the token deck or playing a deck that isn't necessarily going to get a huge bomb off the top, and you are guaranteed to get something. It's not like, oh, if there's something on top. It's, no, you're going until you're getting it, and so it's a really powerful card, and it does cost 5, but, 5 mana, cheat 2 things into play, and an opponent cheats something into play is not bad. Of course, if you are in one of those situations where you are ahead of everyone else and you just can't afford to give them something, you can just pay this for 5, and I love the fact that Demonstrate is optional. Next, we have Fiery Encore. It's a 5-cost red sorcery. Discard a card, then draw a card. When you discard a non-land card this way, it deals damage equal to that card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker. So it can't go face with it, but what's interesting about this card is that it has Storm. So for instance, if you cast 3 spells, or at least 3 spells were cast before it this turn, you pay 5, you are essentially discarding a card, drawing a card. If you discarded a non-land card, you're dealing damage equal to its mana value to a target creature or planeswalker. You're doing that a bunch of times, and it's not like you're discarding 4 cards then drawing 4. You're doing these one at a time, so you really get to pick the best outcome of drawing and discarding for the most part. So pretty good card. I don't know if Storm is really needing this card. However, because you're not actually gaining any card advantage from this, you're not drawing the card first, but it is a way to kind of board wipe and Storm. So I think for lower power Storm decks, because Storm decks in Commander, if you're spending 5 mana on a Storm card, you probably want it to end the game. That is pretty expensive, and so I don't think necessarily this is going to go in high-powered Storm decks, but I think it has some potential. It also can just not go in Storm decks and be a removal spell that also cycles through stuff in your hand, and maybe you get 2 or 3 copies of it. Next we have Inferno Project. It is a 7-cost red creature elemental, 0/0 with trample, and when it enters the battlefield, it enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the total mana value of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. Remember, Prismari is all about those big spells, and oftentimes discarding them and then casting them for free later. So it wouldn't be that uncommon for you to have 25, mana value worth of cards in your library just off of a couple spells. And so if you can manage to get up to 7 mana, this is pretty big, and it enters with trample. Combine it with that octopus that we saw and turn it into an 8/8. It's getting an 8/8. It's an 8/8 with like 20 counters on it with trample. This thing can get out of hand fast. Of course, it is expensive, so it's not a super competitive card, but in a deck that wants to do what the Prismari do, and don't do it with X spells, which is how I would build the Prismari deck, just so that you're not stuck with a bunch of expensive cards. I'd probably put like the cards that you can discard for treasures in there, and then I would also put X spells, and that would be about it. You could put some bigger spells in there as well, but that wouldn't necessarily work as well with this. So it depends on how you're building your big spells deck. But if you're building it in that way where you're discarding to free cast big spells that aren't X spells, that's definitely a valid way to build this deck, and this card would work pretty well in it. Next we have Radiant Performer. This card's pretty crazy. It's a 5-cost red creature, human wizard 2/2 with flash. And when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, so you can't keep rezzing it to get this effect, choose target spell or ability that targets only a single permanent or player. Copy that spell or ability for each other permanent or player the spell or ability could target. Each copy targets a different one of those permanents and players. So that's a really complicated way to say this. Let's say your opponent casts a shock, shock on one of your creatures. You can flash in Radiant Performer and say, actually, I'm going to duplicate this shock for every single target it has, which includes you and your permanent. So let's say there are 13 creatures on the battlefield, there are 4 players, they cast shock, you get 16 copies of this, because the original target, doesn't do that. And I believe it would also target this, copy that spell for each other permanent or player the spell could target. Yeah. So essentially, Radiant Performer is going to get hit by this too, and you're going to shock everything, every player, every creature, which can turn just a shock into a board wipe. But what's really interesting is when you combine that with Magecraft, which lets you, when you copy something, get the ability. So for instance, your commander, if you copied shock even 14 times, you're scrying 14 times with your commander, because every single time it copies, that is a different instance of copying a spell. So this card is pretty crazy. It can also work for like boosting creatures. It can work for, you have a murder spell. Someone cast a murder spell, you flash this in, that turns it into a board wipe. If you have a spell that does some effect, like target creature gets +2/+2 and you gain 2 life. Technically you still control the card, you're just affecting everyone's creature. So you give everything +2/+2 and you gain 2 life per creature. Or, you draw a card per creature if that's something that it does. Or, you could even, if you have a spell that's dealing a bunch of damage, but it's not enough to kill you, but it's enough to kill all your opponents, you flash this in, you take your one thing that was going to deal 15 damage to this player, and now it's dealing 15 damage to each player, including you. So very, very powerful. One of the more, I wouldn't say janky cards, but I think one that has a lot of interesting potential in those style of decks. Next, we have Rousing Refrain. It's a 5-cost red sorcery. Add red for each card in target opponent's hand, which is a pretty powerful effect. However, normally it doesn't cost 5. But the reason it costs 5 is that you can suspend it for 2 mana, and you get it 3 turns later. By the way, that mana doesn't you don't lose that mana as steps and phases end, and then you exile it with 3 time counters on it. So it's just like the blue one, except instead of drawing 2 cards every 3 turns, you are adding anywhere from 0 to 7 mana. Which, honestly, if you could tell me that turn 5, I'm going to get a bonus 6 mana, that's pretty good. So you don't miss a land drop. That's 11 mana turn 5, assuming you didn't ramp and you just hit all your land drops. I think this is a pretty good card and probably better than the blue one, just because you can get it started turn 2. Turn 5 is not too late in the game, whereas turn 6 is where you really start running into issues. It's like, congrats, you drew 2 cards on turn 6. But getting, 5 or 6 extra mana on turn 5, that's a pretty big deal. So I think this card is better than the other one, in my opinion. It's also a really good target to copy and stuff, because you get lots of mana and lets you do more nonsense. Next, we have Surge to Victory. It's a 6-cost red sorcery. Exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. Creatures you control get +X/+O until end of turn, where X is that card's mana value. So if you exile a 7-cost from your graveyard, creatures, you get +7/+0 until end of turn. And then whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player this turn, copy the exiled card. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Okay, so at first I was like, oh, so this is going to exile something big from your graveyard, boost all your creatures. That's all it does, right? But no. This card is crazy. You exile an 8-drop from your graveyard. Cool. Not only are all your creatures 8 bigger, but for every single one that hits a player, you get a copy of the spell. So let's say it was a 7-drop that drew you 3 cards. Not really a thing. I think there's one that draws you 7 cards for that mana. For each creature that's hitting, you are drawing 7 cards and getting a copy of that spell, and they're bigger. So people are going to start blocking these creatures, meaning it's going to take out a bunch of creatures. Of course, the card does remain exiled, so you can't free cast it later. But yeah, this is an insane card. You know, you put an ultimatum under this, and you can manage to get through, like, you are going to be set up and probably win the game. So this thing can be an epic finisher. At first I was like, this is really lame, but then reading into it and realizing that every single creature that hits is going to let you free cast this spell, it's crazy. Next, we have Reinterpret. It is a 4-cost blue and red instant counter target spell. You may cast a spell with equal or lesser mana value from your hand without paying its mana cost. So your opponent casts their big 8-drop. You say, not only do you get to counter it, you get to say, I also have an 8-drop and and cast that. So it's very similar to Mana Drain, where you're kind of getting value equal to the mana spent that your opponent spent, but this is making you do it at the time, and it's putting it directly into a creature rather than adding mana. Much more fair. Obviously, it's also pretty expensive, but I think it's pretty good. Next, we have Elementalist Palette. It's a 3-cost artifact. Whenever you cast a spell with X in its mana cost, put 2 charge counters on Elementalist Palette. Tap, add 1 mana of any color, or you can tap and add colorless for each charge counter on Elementalist Palette. Spend this mana only to Spend that mana only on costs that contain X. So at its worst, it's a 3 mana artifact that taps for 1 of any color. But if you throw this into a like X matters deck, you know, you cast something that has an X in its cost, maybe for 3, you put 2 counters on this. And by the way, tapping to add, mana doesn't use up those charge counters. So it just gets bigger. Every time you cast an X spell, you're being able to add more mana. So I have a Gruul version of the deck, and I am totally throwing this in it. It is going to be awesome. This is one of the cards I'm actually most excited for, and it's pretty basic, but it really boosts up the X matters decks. Either way, guys, that is it for all the spoilers. Let's quickly jump into the deck list. I just want to show it. I'm not really going to talk too much about it, but this is the deck list. There are some pretty spicy cards in there, like Blasphemous Act, some pretty cool stuff like that, Serum Vision, Epic Experiment, cool stuff like that. But yeah, that is it for this video. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.